Hello, you watch Afghan News with Mohsen Jamal. General David Petraeus says he is not sure what his next job will be, but that he has committed to staying as the top commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan through the fighting season. Petraeus addressed speculation about his future job while talking to reporters at a farewell ceremony for top NATO civilian representative Mark Sedwell in Kabul. To answer if he wanted to become CIA director, Petraeus said he didn't think it was appropriate to comment on whatever job might be considered for him. Petraeus also said he did not agree with reports that Al-Qaeda was making a comeback in Afghanistan. 4 Taliban militants were killed and another 4 injured when the NATO-led forces conducted an airstrike against insurgents in Kapisa province. A district administrative chief said on Saturday. Mullah Muhammad Alaisi district chief said that the international forces launched an airstrike against insurgents in Al-Asai district in the wee hours Saturday, resulting in the deaths of 4 Taliban insurgents and injuring 4 others. According to initial information, no civilian casualties has been reported in the air raid attack that took place in Bahadur Khail village, the official added. According to local police sources, a similar attack in neighboring Najrab district had killed 14 insurgents, including a Taliban deputy Shadowy governor for Kapisa province Thursday night. Taliban militants, Afghan and NATO forces have not commented on the issues yet. Hundreds of protesters demanding that Hosni Mubarak, the former Egyptian president, be put on trial for alleged corruption have retaken Cairo's iconic Tahrir Square hours after security forces attempted to disperse them. By 7 a.m. local time on Saturday morning, Army and Central Security troops appeared to have withdrawn, leaving the square to protesters who set vehicles on fire and began setting up barricades made of furniture and left behind barbed wire. Hundreds of Army and Security Forces troops had stormed the square earlier in an attempt to disperse the thousands of protesters. And since reminiscent of the violent 18-day uprising that ousted longtime President Mubarak in February, protesters and riot police threw rocks at each other and security forces responded by firing tear gas, witnesses said. The military in a statement said that security forces were attempting to enforce a 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. local time curfew. A separate statement carried on the military's Facebook page blamed remnants of Mubarak's National Democratic Party for the clashes and ordered the arrest of 4 party members, 8 accused of thuggery during the sit-in. Forces loyal to Côte d'Ivoire incumbent Laurent Gbagbo have regained ground in Abidjan and fully controlled the Apiscal Plateau and Cocody areas, UN peacekeeping chief Alain Leroy said on Friday. Leroy said that Gbagbo's forces under attack by those of internationally recognized President Alassane Ouattara had used a lull for peace talks that began on Tuesday as a trick to reinforce their positions. They still had heavy weapons, though UN and French forces had destroyed some of them. Leroy told reporters after briefing the UN Security Council. Saint Alain, a Gbagbo spokesman, denied that forces loyal to Gbagbo had access to heavy weapons. This came as Gbagbo's possible advance led diplomats from 23 countries to ask UN and French forces for help evacuating, and the United Nations said that Indian, South Korean, South African and Israeli diplomats had been moved away in armored personnel carriers with military escorts, while diplomats from the German, United States and Brazilian embassies were among those awaiting UN help. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Hillary Clinton, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, issued an alert on a potential humanitarian crisis and denounced attacks on UN peacekeepers. Also, the World Food Program and UN relief agencies have appealed for humanitarian corridors to be set up in order to ensure safe access to fleeing civilians and to ease aid deliveries from Liberia and Ghana. A Democratic 11th hour deal between Democrats and Republicans over the budget has staved off a U.S. government shutdown. We have agreed to an historic amount of cash. John Boehner, the House of Representatives Speaker, and Harry Reid, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, said on Friday in a joint statement that capped months of bitter feuding over reigning in Washington in the face of a galloping deficit. After the deal was reached, Barack Obama, the U.S. President, said at the White House that the agreement between Democrats and Republicans on behalf of all Americans is on a budget that that invests in future while making the largest annual spending cut in history. Boehner said that the deal had been struck on funding the federal government for the rest of the fiscal year that ends on September 30th. Party leaders clinched the agreement, including some $38.5 billion of extra spending cuts after an intense political bargaining barely an hour before the federal government was to run out of money at midnight. A shutdown, the first in more than 50 years, would have seen around 800,000 federal employees temporarily laid off, paychecks for frontline combat soldiers delayed, and national parks and monuments closed, while potentially undermining the U.S. economic recovery. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department's annual report on human rights expressed hope Friday that the protests against authoritarian rule sweeping the Middle East will yield sustainable democracies in the region. The report included sharp criticism of the human rights records of China, North Korea, Cuba, and Belarus, among others. The report nominally covered human rights in 2010 but did not ignore the so-called Arab Spring democracy protests this year in Middle East and North African countries, and said if they succeed, the region and with it the whole world will be improved. Introducing the State Department's 35th annual survey of rights conditions worldwide, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said those pushing for reform can count on U.S. report. Clinton cited three worrisome trends on the human rights front, including a widespread crackdown on civil society groups and activists, violations of free expression through internet curbs, and discrimination against vulnerable minorities, including gays and lesbians. In a more detailed comment than is customary for a Secretary of State at the human rights event, Clinton lamented crackdowns on civil society groups in Venezuela and Russia. And Syrian security forces have killed at least 27 demonstrators in the southern city of Daraa amid fresh pro-reform demonstrations, hospital sources and witnesses say. The deaths occurred after Friday prayers when security forces opened fire with rubber-coated bullets and live rounds to disperse stone-throwing protesters. But the state-run Sana news agency said 19 members of the security forces were killed and 75 people wounded by armed groups during the protests. In the east, thousands of ethnic Kurds also demonstrated for reform despite the Syrian president's offer this week to ease rules which bar many Kurds from citizenship. Separate protests erupted in the western port city of Latakia, Tartus, Banyas, Homs, Idlib in the northwest of the country and in the other cities. Popular demonstrations calling for greater freedoms have shaken Syria for the last 3 weeks. President Bashar al-Assad has responded with a blend of force against protesters and reform gestures, most recently aimed at ethnic Kurds. Human Rights Watch said before Friday's violence that more than 100 people had been killed in the protests. And that is all for now. Thanks for staying with us.